Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, so as Catherine said, my name is Cormac Nolan. I'm the Policy Officer with the Sustainable Water Network, and I'm going to give you a rundown of our draft submission, some of the main points, just to possibly give you an in or a start, or to bolster some of your own ideas for your submissions. Just before we start, I'm not a planning expert. I am an expert in marine ecology and fisheries science, and I am a member of the MSP advisory group. So I'm going to focus this talk and our submission on the marine environment. These points are not the final SWAN position just yet. They're still being signed off by the members, but they shouldn't change too much. I won't be covering the strategic environmental assessment, the Nature impact statement, or the appropriate assessment in this presentation. And if you like what you hear or see today, you can subscribe to the monthly SWAN newsletter on our website at swanireland.ie. So just to give you a sort of policy context of where this plan fits in, where the Marine Spatial Plan fits in, SWAN made up this infographic earlier in the year when there was a lot of different consultations going on, and a lot of different acronyms beginning with M. So I suppose the biggest one on our radar is the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is the EU strategy to achieve good environmental status in our waters. It has a number of different phases. Phase 1 of the second cycle has kicked off, has just finished public consultation, and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive gives the ecosystem approach to the Marine Spatial Plan. It also has, as one of its requirements, marine protected areas, and marine protected areas have to be accounted for in marine spatial planning as well. So marine spatial planning is quite in the middle of all of this, and underpinning the Marine Spatial Plan, as Conor mentioned, is the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill. And we can't talk about the draft National Marine Planning Framework without mentioning the bill because of its importance. So I'll be discussing that later on as well. If you'd like to read more about these different marine consultations going on and how they interact, as well as this infographic, we have a little document that goes behind this, just explaining them a little bit further. It's a 2-pager, and if you search SWAN Marine Consultation Guide, you'll find it. So let me begin with some positives of the draft National Marine Planning Framework. The number of overarching marine planning policies that relate to the marine environment is really positive, and as Conor said, they're right at the start of the document, which is really great. A big change from the baseline report, where the marine environment was just a chapter like any other activity. There are a lot of other commendable inclusions like heritage, rural and coastal communities, seascapes and landscapes. And the MSP Roadshow, Conor mentioned, they had a lot of meetings. It's been some solid steps made towards a good public consultation there. And also, like I mentioned, the department has been responsive to a lot of our submissions to previous iterations of this, like the baseline report. They've really taken on board some of the things we've said and made changes to their to this draft plan. But SWAN does have some issues, and I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 of them today. A brief overview, I'm going to talk about prioritization and marine protected areas. I'm going to talk about fisheries and aquaculture and the legal underpinning. The ecosystem-based approach and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And I'm going to talk about how the environmental, economic and social pillars are prioritized in the draft plan. And then at the very end, as a little bonus, I'll go through a little selection of technical points. It might whet your appetite for a little into the document. And just to quickly mention my background, this part here, it has the wrong outline for the Marine Spatial Plan because that's the actual outline. But I've chosen this background very specifically because it has our marine protected areas in it, which is a big part of our concerns for this document, and is a big part of our submission. So this map here shows the proposed and existing marine protected areas in the Northeast Atlantic. The existing are in blue and the proposed are in the hatched lines. Now you'll see that Ireland is lagging quite far behind its neighbours. At the moment we have 2.3% coverage of our marine waters by MPAs. We should be at 10% now in 2020 under our agreements with the Convention for Biodiversity and the Sustainable Development Goals. But we're at 2.3 and have been for quite some time. The process has started to expand that network, but it's a bit behind the MSP. So like I said, we're on 2.3% MPA coverage at the moment. We should be at 10%, and there's a further target that's on the table of 30% by 2030. These obligations are under all sorts of directives and agreements like the MSFD, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, the SDG, OSPAR, Birds and Habitats Directive. So this space here, in my background, this space is going to get a lot busier in the near future. But like I said, marine spatial planning is further along the road than marine protected areas, the legislation in particular. The zoning for human activities, the sectoral plans under this draft National Marine Planning Framework, they'll almost certainly happen prior to the new MPAs being put in place. Conor mentioned the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill. That will have provisions under it. That'll provide the legislation to make certain spatial designations, but not marine protected areas. The MPDN bill has been under construction in various guises for many years. The MPA, the Marine Protected Area legislation, hasn't even begun. So for a proper marine spatial planning, you really need to get the conservation layer in place first before allowing zoning for other activities. So we've got the cart before the horse here. So what is SWAN asking to change in the final NMPF? But we need to properly address the issue of prioritization in the final document by elaborating and clarifying the process of designating the marine activity zones, including their proposed governance. And this is of such importance that it should be included in the main body of the plan, not in a short appendix as it is at the moment. We also think that some form of sensitivity mapping should be conducted as a matter of urgency to identify the areas that will probably be future MPAs, and to use this knowledge to preserve those areas while we're waiting for the MPA legislation to be enacted. As I mentioned, the MPDN bill underpins many parts of this National Marine Planning Framework, and that bill aims to modernise Irish marine consenting and licensing regime. But as it's written, it does not include fisheries and aquaculture. In fact, it doesn't include anything that's under the remit of the Department of Agriculture. So therefore, fisheries and aquaculture are excluded from this forward planning and improved licensing. They're mentioned in the NMPF, but they're not in the bill. So this is a problem for both the aquaculture. So for instance, particularly for aquaculture, such a spatially defined activity in such bad need of a reform of its licensing, this is a problem for industry and the environment. The industry is worried they'll be left behind when all the other sectors get their sectoral plans, and they'll be left with a licensing system that still takes years to get a license, and environmental groups are worried that the proper enforcement won't be applicable after the MPDN bill comes in. So a key ask from SWAN in our submission is that if and when the MPDN bill is taken back up by the new government, that the inclusion of aquaculture and fisheries in the new regime must be of the highest priority. Now that's a political ask. Maybe the MPDF can't address that, but what it could do is state the need in the final MPF is to state the need and highlight the risks of not including an activity in the underpinning legislation. Moving on to the third of our main points, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the ecosystem approach to fisheries management. I'm particularly picking out fisheries here. I'm going to talk about two parts of the National Marine Planning Framework document. In paragraph 3.24, which is quite near the start of the document, the draft sets out the MSFD descriptors that are to be excluded, that don't lend themselves to sort of a state level plan-led MSP. And one of the descriptors to be excluded is commercial fisheries, descriptor 3. And it is said to be excluded because it's covered under the Common Fisheries Policy. But the CFP is mainly concerned with stocks and less so with the spatial impact of gears on the seafloor habitat. And also the CFP does not cover smaller inshore vessels fishing for national stocks, like stocks that don't have total allowable catch dictated by the EU. In the fishing chapter of the draft document, paragraph 12.24, it mentions the MSFD and good environmental status, but it only talks about D3. Commercial populations of commercially exploited fish and shellfish are within safe biological limits. But D3 is actually not the most relevant descriptor to this activity. The consultation document even dismisses it, as I talked about in the last slide. The consultation document even dismisses it as being dealt with by the CFP in the introductory chapter. The actual biggest impact of commercial fisheries is on seafloor integrity, particularly from mobile bottom contacting gears like trawls and dredges. So descriptor 6, seafloor integrity, is what they should be talking about in that chapter. Now, the MSFD has just gone through a round of public consultation, and the draft D6 assessment shows the actual spatial impact of bottom trawling gears on Ireland's seafloor habitat. And at the very least, and it's an underestimation, 13% of Ireland's seafloor is being adversely impacted by bottom contacting fishing gears. So SWAN is asking that it is essential that those maps of benthic disturbance and loss from the latest D6 assessment are what needs to be included in the issues for sustainability section of the fisheries chapter of the draft National Marine Planning Framework. The fourth main issue, Conor actually touched on this, it's that the draft NMPF puts all three of these pillars on an equal footing: the environmental, the economic and the social pillars. That follows on from harnessing our ocean wealth, and I think it's mentioned in the actual MSP directive as well. But SWAN would argue that without a well-functioning marine environment, almost all of the benefits enjoyed under the other two pillars would cease to be. So SWAN would ask that the primacy of a healthy marine environment is made clear in the document, and that they should adopt the Sustainable Development Goals wedding cake or donut approach, which is shown on the right, which puts the biosphere as the basis and the societal and economic pillars as sort of tiers of the wedding cake. Just a selection of other points. I won't go into them in so much detail, but happy to talk through them afterwards. The document is still a bit compartmentalized between all the different sectors and activities. Marine spatial planning should be about seeing the overlap, the interactivity, the seasonality, all of these sort of things. So it's hard to see them in a document. You would really need something like the online marine atlas to be able to turn on and off layers to really get a good feel of how all these different things occur in the same space. I know Conor mentioned my plan, but that's 3 years away. We have a marine atlas now that could be used for this to show the public how these things actually, how many of them overlap. The issues for sustainability are quite lacking in several chapters. Two in particular would be defence and security, and really lacking in seaweed harvesting. There's only one sentence in that section under seaweed harvesting. They've really completely missed the main issue for sustainability in seaweed harvesting, and that's how it's harvested. Using mechanical dredgers to harvest seaweed would be a huge issue, and it's completely lacking from that section. The overarching marine planning policy for the seafloor only mentions the deep sea floor. Now, from fisheries point of view, deep sea would begin maybe 400 or 500 meters deep, whereas the MSP, it really needs to cover all of the seafloor. So that wording needs to be changed to remove deep sea and just have seafloor. And finally, there are other parts in the SWAN submission. There are other parts of the MSFD that we think should be included. For instance, descriptor 7, which is hydrographic conditions, that's listed in the introductory parts of the NMPF as being excluded because it doesn't lend itself to a plan-led MSP. But in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive assessment that just went to public consultation, almost all of the pressures identified for hydrographic conditions are chapters, are activity chapters in this draft document. So we would strongly argue that D7 needs to be included in this marine spatial plan as well. So just to say thanks again for having me. I'm open to any questions, comments, or especially corrections. I would encourage you to make a submission. I hope I've given you some either strengthening of your own thoughts, strengthening of your own submissions or ideas. And I will say that it doesn't matter how small your submission, if you only want to comment on one paragraph, it's all still important. And thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks a million, Cormac. That was a lovely overview. It feels a lot more streamlined than the than the introduction to it, which was fairly heavy. If I could ask you to just stop the screen share there so that we can get the chat up and all that. Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, so again, if you want to, you can click that little hand raise button, or you can type a question out in the comments, or you can just say that you have a question to ask in the comments and we'll get around to you. So any questions for Cormac?
Cormac, you mentioned there it's Patrick Dunleer, SEC again. You mentioned there Ireland's lagging behind with the 2.3% of the MPA. Why are we lagging behind other countries in that area?
The simple answer is political ambition. that has changed slightly now. So, well, actually, up until now, really the only MPAs we could make are under the Birds and Habitats Directive, the Natura 2000 sites. And we have had letters from the EU saying that we don't have enough reef covered, for instance, on the offshore and things like that. But there is movement on this now. There's a Marine Protected Area Advisory Group set up. The Minister has stated his intention to meet the 10%, and we will be expanding in the near future. The problem is legislation. Like I said, there's absolutely no legislation there to be able to make any MPAs other than Natura 2000 sites.
Okay. Thank you for that.
And Sean O'Farrell there is mentioning inland water got no mention. Is inland water within this consultation, or is it something that's outside of it as well?
Yeah, the Water Framework Directive covers the coastal waters out to 1 nautical mile, I believe. So the Water Framework Directive is mentioned once or twice in the draft plan. SWAN, one of SWAN's points in submission will be to strengthen that and to really link it up. As an aside, SWAN also is in discussions with the department around things like the significant water management issues under the Water Framework Directive to get more marine, to get more linkage between the marine areas and in the Water Framework Directive and other policy, other marine policy.
Yeah, presumably linking all them up would be a big part of this whole project. And a few more questions coming in. Any views on enforcement from Natasha?
Yeah, we had a discussion. We discussed this actually. Coastwatch held I think it was at their launch of the latest results. We had a very good discussion about this. That Ireland is actually very good at making plans. Where we fall down is the enforcement side of things. So, yeah, this plan could be the perfect plan, but we need to up our enforcement game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that a lot of the time it's left up to people in communities and that kind of thing to actually push for enforcement. So I don't know what we'll do on that. But another question: has the EU a part to play here? Is there any links with the EU?
Well, the EU is driving all of this, and yeah, without that directive, I don't think this would have been happening. Is that? I'm not. Maybe you could elaborate on the question.
Okay, that was Oliver. If Oliver would like to add anything, feel free. Oh, sorry, you're muted there, Oliver. 1 second. No, you should be unmuted now.
Sorry, something going off here. I just wondered if the EU are involved in it, and will they fund it, and will they fund it basically, or help fund it, because things are going to be bleak for a couple of years now. I think there won't be much money around.
Oh, I'm not sure, Oliver. I don't know.
Just looking back on the two talks now and what we're talking about now, it looks like this is going to take a long time, and it's not very encouraging, to say the least, from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, it's gonna take a long time, but in fairness to the department, they're on schedule for this. They published their timeline for this 2 years ago, and they've stuck to it almost exactly. But you're right. Once we get into the enforcement and the real business end of it, it will take a lot of money.
But if you went to a private company, or were a private company, and you wanted a pen, and someone said it was going to take 3 years, they'd say, well, we better do something else, because 3 years, and it probably won't be finished in 3 years either, based on the history of getting plans done in Ireland. We have marine planning for marina, and it's an election promise every year for as long as I'm involved with the Chamber of Commerce in Westport, and that's I started about 25 years ago. Keeps coming up, doesn't happen, you know. So you get a little bit disillusioned. Not saying you're going to be the same way about it anyway.
Okay, thanks for that, Oliver.
Getting too old for this.
We have a few questions there about seaweed harvesting, so I'll just read both of them at the same time. What recommendations are out there for seaweed harvest licensing? It's from Trish and Elizabeth. Just interested to hear, for seaweed harvesting currently there's a prevalence of mechanical dredging even where companies claim hand harvesting, and how clear is the licensing for seaweed harvesting sites?
Yeah, I'm in no way an expert in seaweed harvesting, but I would encourage you to visit the Bantry Bay Save Our Native Kelp Forest website. They're brilliant. They have, yeah, I can't, I don't know enough about seaweed harvesting to answer those specific questions.
No worries. Yeah, I know the Bantry Bay people have a lot of research done on that. They've been fighting it down there for a while. So yeah, I'd second that to go check them out if you have any specific interest in seaweed harvesting. Is there, from Monica, is there any plan to map invasive marine species? From the Horizon Scan Invasive Species Workshop, it was very notable how Ireland is lacking in information on marine invasive species as opposed to the freshwater and terrestrial species. So any plan to map invasive marine species?
Yes, this actually has more to do with the MSFD. In the recent MSFD assessment that just finished public consultation on the 28th of February, descriptor, it's gone off the top of my head, but the descriptor on non-Indigenous species was quite sparse, and it mainly just talked about the number of invasive species or non-Indigenous species in the last 10 years, and how the target was to make that number very low. In SWAN's response to that public consultation, we said something quite similar to what you've just said, that we really need to map. It's not just about the number, we need to map where they are, how they're having an effect, and they really need to do more work and look at more criteria under that descriptor. So, but to bring it back to the National Marine Planning Framework, what SWAN has said about non-Indigenous species in the planning framework is that the title says non-Indigenous species, but all the planning policies talk about invasive species, so that they need to be clear there. Are they concerned with just invasives or all non-Indigenous?
Okay, so that would probably be worth including, that they make sure to elaborate on which one they're talking about and what they are.
Yeah.
Okay. Good stuff.
Thanks.
Oh yeah, and if anyone does want to jump in with an addition to their question, please do. Don't feel like I'm just running through your questions and getting answers. So that you can jump in here. Roisin McAleer is saying, thank you, Cormac. How do we communicate the shortcomings or concerns SWAN has to ordinary people and to communities? This affects every one of us, but not everyone is in a position to understand, never mind engage with the documents, legal jargon, etc., or to make submissions. As a community group rep, I would like to convey a clear and simple message that empowers people to submit their views too. I guess this is a problem with the public consultation process, which is fundamentally flawed. A simple, plain and accessible message from SWAN would help us relay concerns and hopefully open up the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, there's over 200 pages in the document, and then there's another 300 or 400 pages in the associated environmental impact assessments. And yeah, so SWAN, we've been talking about this sort of stuff within SWAN as well, how to make it easier for our members to make a submission. Say if this isn't their primary focus, you know, but they want to support us and make a quick submission, or if they have one thing that's of issue to them and they don't want to have to trawl through 200 pages. So we're doing things like this. We're sending guidance notes to our members. We're doing things like the marine consultation guide, like the infographic I showed. We're making that public on Twitter and things like that. But it's tough. I mean, one of the things we're thinking about doing for future public consultations is maybe just a short letter that addresses our key points, that people could put their name to the top and submit it if they agree with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know there was a question about how effective that kind of method is of kind of, you know, getting loads of names on one proposal.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think personally, I think it's you know, better than nothing. If you don't have the time or energy or capacity to look through everything, putting your name on something is better than nothing. But
yeah, so in our submission that we made next week, we also have a big section on how they can improve their public consultation. And you know, I mentioned that their roadshow was good. They had a lot of meetings, but the issues raised at the roadshow, the things that were talked through with the invited experts, with the people from the department, no, they won't be officially taken down as submissions to the consultation. It's only if it's in writing to this consultation on next Thursday that they'll be considered. So one of our suggestions is that while their roadshow was good, they need to improve how, like move from public consultation to public engagement, and start taking down the things said at those public events as actual submissions.